That, along with our other policies, will allow our auto industry to absolutely boom. It's going to boom.
I showed discounts of over $8,000 off of MSRP. So while we're here at Chevy and GMC,
The company announcing they're eliminating the low-selling Chevrolet Cruze, Volt, and Impala cars from their roster.
As today is the final day, the Chevy Cruze will come off the line in Lordstown, Ohio. This is just one of 5 plants GM announced would be closing. 2 of those right here in Metro Detroit, the Detroit Hamtramck and Warren assembly plants.
Chevrolet has vanished from the very assembly lines that once defined it. Factories in Michigan, Texas, and Missouri, once the pride of American steel and labor, now sit silent.
This didn't start in Detroit. It started with where automakers see the future. For decades, the United States sat at the center of the global auto industry. Factories ran nonstop, supply chains pointed inward, and automakers built their futures around American demand. But something has changed, not overnight, not with a single announcement, quietly global. Car makers have started looking elsewhere. While the U.S. auto market struggles with rising costs, trade barriers, and shifting consumer demand, a different market is gaining attention: Africa. Once seen as a distant opportunity, Africa is now being treated as a strategic priority. Lower production costs, rapidly growing consumer markets, expanding EV infrastructure. Automakers aren't leaving the U.S., but they are rebalancing. And that shift is already reshaping investment decisions, factory plans, and long-term strategy. This isn't a story about decline. It is a story about leverage and how Africa is becoming the next growth engine in a global industry that can no longer afford to stand still. For most of the last century, the United States stood at the center of the global auto industry. Decisions made in Detroit echoed across supply chains. Worldwide, steel production, labor contracts, dealership networks, and consumer trends all revolved around American demand. For automakers, success in the U.S. market was not just important, it was essential. That certainty is beginning to fade. In recent years, the U.S. auto market has become more complex, more expensive, and less predictable. Rising production costs, tighter regulations, shifting consumer preferences, and trade-related friction have introduced new layers of risk. Automakers that once planned decades ahead around American factories are now revisiting those assumptions. At the same time, a different region is drawing increased attention. Africa. For a long time, Africa was discussed as a future opportunity rather than a present priority. A continent with potential, but not yet scale. That perception is changing faster than many expected. Population growth, urbanization, infrastructure investment, and policy reform are combining to create conditions automakers can no longer ignore. This is not a sudden migration of factories or a dramatic withdrawal from the United States. It is something quieter and more strategic. Automakers are diversifying where they invest, where they assemble, and where they plan for long-term growth, and Africa is increasingly part of those plans. In the U.S., manufacturers are facing pressure from multiple directions. Steel and aluminum costs remain volatile. Supply chains are still adjusting after years of disruption. Electric vehicle transitions require massive upfront investment while consumer demand remains uneven. Profit margins are thinner, timelines are shorter, and mistakes are more costly. These pressures have forced executives to ask difficult questions. Where can production be scaled efficiently? Where is demand growing fastest? Where do long-term demographics favor sustained vehicle ownership and mobility expansion? For many companies, Africa is emerging as a compelling answer. Several African economies are positioning themselves as manufacturing and assembly hubs. Governments are offering incentives, improving industrial zones, and investing in logistics corridors that connect factories to ports and regional markets. Trade frameworks are making it easier to move vehicles and components across borders. And local workforces are expanding, younger and increasingly skilled. The appeal is not limited to cost. Africa represents demand. By mid-century, Africa is expected to have the largest working-age population in the world. Urban centers are growing rapidly. Public transport systems are expanding, but private mobility remains essential across much of the continent. Two-wheelers, passenger cars, commercial vehicles, and electric alternatives are all seeing rising interest. Automakers understand what this means. Growth does not always come from selling more cars in saturated markets. It comes from entering markets where vehicle ownership is still expanding. This contrast is becoming sharper when compared to the United States. American auto demand remains significant, but it is no longer growing at the pace it once did. Consumers are holding vehicles longer. Financing costs are higher. Competition is intense. Regulatory uncertainty adds complexity to long-term planning. In this environment, companies are hedging their bets. Some are expanding assembly operations in African countries. Others are forming partnerships with local firms to test markets and reduce risk. EV manufacturers are exploring opportunities tied to Africa's role in battery materials, renewable energy potential, and localized production. None of this means the U.S. auto industry is disappearing, but it does mean its position as the unquestioned center of gravity is being challenged. This shift has consequences. In the United States, communities built around auto manufacturing are feeling the pressure. Investment decisions that once defaulted to domestic expansion are now weighed against global alternatives. New plants are debated more carefully. Automation replaces labor where margins are tight. Suppliers face uncertainty as contracts become shorter and more conditional. The language used by executives reflects this change. Discussions now emphasize flexibility, regional balance, and strategic diversification. These are not signs of panic, they are signs of adaptation. Africa's role in this adaptation is growing. Countries across the continent are learning from past industrialization efforts elsewhere. They are focusing on incremental growth, regional integration, and export competitiveness, rather than trying to replicate legacy auto hubs overnight. They are building ecosystems step by step. This approach aligns well with modern manufacturing. Modular production, regional assembly, and scalable platforms make it possible to grow without massive upfront commitments. For automakers, this reduces risk and increases optionality. It also changes leverage when companies have multiple viable locations for production and growth. No single market holds all the power. This is where the U.S. auto market's challenges intersect with Africa's rise. As Africa becomes more viable, the relative bargaining position of traditional markets weakens. This does not mean automakers are abandoning the U.S., it means the U.S. must compete. Competition today looks different than it did in the past. It is no longer just about size or history. It is about cost structures, policy stability, infrastructure, readiness, and future demand. Africa is increasingly competitive on these dimensions. The electric vehicle transition adds another layer. Africa holds significant reserves of minerals essential to EV production. It also has growing renewable energy capacity in several regions. This creates opportunities for vertically integrated strategies that connect resource extraction, battery production, and vehicle assembly. Automakers are paying attention. What was once a long-term maybe is becoming a near-term where and how. Pilot projects, feasibility studies, and early investments are already underway. These are the early signals of a broader shift. Back in the United States, the auto market continues to adjust. Sales fluctuate, policy debates continue, investment flows are scrutinized. The industry remains powerful, but it is no longer insulated from global competition in the way it once was. Africa's rise does not require America's decline, but it does redefine the landscape. Global industries are moving toward a more distributed model of growth. Influence is shared across regions rather than concentrated in one. Markets that understand this and adapt will thrive. Those that assume their position is guaranteed will struggle. This is the context in which automakers are shifting focus toward Africa, not as a replacement but as a strategic pillar of the future. And as this transition unfolds, the balance of the global auto industry will continue to evolve quietly, deliberately, and with lasting impact. What ultimately defines this moment is not the struggle of a single market or the success of another, but the transition taking place across the global auto industry. The era when growth flowed automatically toward established centers is giving way to a system shaped by flexibility, competition, and long-term planning. In that system, Africa is no longer waiting on the sidelines. For automakers, the shift toward Africa is not an act of abandonment, it is a recognition of reality. Markets evolve, demographics change. Cost structures shift. Companies that survive are those that anticipate where demand, talent, and opportunity will exist tomorrow, not just where they existed yesterday. Africa's appeal lies in more than numbers. It reflects a broader transformation in how the continent engages with global industries. Governments are refining industrial policy. Regional cooperation is reducing trade friction. Infrastructure projects are closing gaps that once made large-scale manufacturing difficult. These changes are not uniform, but they are cumulative. The result is a continent that offers something increasingly rare in mature markets: room to grow. For the United States, this moment invites reflection rather than retreat. The auto industry remains innovative, capable, and deeply rooted, but its future influence will depend on adaptability. Investment decisions can no longer rely on history alone. They must compete in a world where alternatives exist and leverage is shared. This recalibration is already visible. Companies are balancing domestic commitments with global diversification. Supply chains are being redesigned for resilience rather than speed. Production strategies are becoming regional rather than centralized. None of this signals collapse. It signals adjustment. Africa's role in that adjustment is growing precisely because it is being approached differently, not as a single market but as a collection of emerging hubs connected by trade, policy alignment, and long-term ambition. Automakers are learning that success in Africa requires partnership, patience, and local integration. Those willing to make that investment stand to benefit from sustained growth. The broader lesson extends beyond automobiles. The same dynamics are reshaping energy, technology, manufacturing, and logistics. Africa's economic rise is not driven by confrontation but by participation. It is asserting itself not by rejecting the global system but by engaging with it on more equal terms. This is what makes the current shift so consequential. Power in the global economy is becoming more distributed. Influence is earned through relevance, not assumed through legacy. Markets that adapt to this reality will remain competitive. Those that resist it will face increasing pressure. For viewers watching this unfold, the key takeaway is simple. The global auto industry is not moving in one direction, it is expanding outward. And Africa is becoming one of the places where the future is being built. As automakers continue to reassess where they invest, manufacture, and sell, Africa's presence in those conversations will only grow stronger. Not because it is fashionable, but because it is viable. Not because it replaces existing markets, but because it complements them. The US auto market still matters, but it now operates in a world where options exist, and in that world, Africa's rising influence is reshaping how decisions are made. This is not the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. It is the convergence of both. A moment where established industries and emerging markets meet at the crossroads of change. How that story unfolds will depend on who adapts, who invests, and who understands that the future of global industry is no longer centered in one place. It is shared, and Africa is now firmly part of that future. What makes this transition especially important is that it is happening quietly. There are no dramatic announcements declaring a new center of the global auto industry. No single headline captures the scale of the shift. Instead, it unfolds through investment memos, feasibility studies, and long-term planning sessions inside boardrooms around the world. Automakers are asking new questions. Where will the next generation of consumers live? Where will labor be available at scale? Where can manufacturing grow without running into cost ceilings, regulatory bottlenecks, or saturated demand? Increasingly, Africa appears in the answers. This does not mean companies are abandoning traditional markets. North America, Europe, and East Asia remain critical pillars of the auto industry. But the era of relying on one or two regions to carry global growth is ending. Risk diversification is no longer optional. It is strategic. Africa offers something that many mature markets cannot: a long growth runway, with a rapidly expanding population. Accelerating urbanization and improving infrastructure, demand for mobility is rising. Not just luxury vehicles or niche imports, but practical transportation for businesses, families, and logistics networks. This demand creates opportunity not only for sales but for manufacturing ecosystems, suppliers, technicians, logistics firms, and service networks. At the same time, African governments are becoming more intentional. Industrialization is no longer framed as an abstract goal. It is tied to employment, technology transfer, and regional competitiveness. Incentives are being structured to encourage local assembly, skills training, and export capacity. These policies send a clear message. Africa wants to be part of the value chain, not just the consumer base. For automakers facing rising costs elsewhere, this alignment matters. In the United States, the auto industry is navigating a difficult balance. Tariffs, labor costs, and supply chain disruptions have increased pressure on margins. Electrification adds another layer of complexity, requiring massive capital investment amid uncertain consumer adoption rates. These challenges do not signal decline, but they do demand recalibration. Africa enters this picture not as a replacement but as an expansion point. By spreading production and sourcing across regions, automakers can reduce exposure to localized shocks. They can tailor vehicles to regional needs. They can build resilience into systems that were once optimized only for efficiency. This is why the conversation around Africa has changed. It is no longer framed as potential someday. It is framed as planning now, and that shift carries implications beyond economics. Global influence follows industrial presence. Where factories operate, skills develop. Where supply chains form, political and economic relationships deepen. Africa's growing role in manufacturing strengthens its position in global negotiations not through confrontation but through relevance. For the United States, this evolution presents a strategic choice. One path is defensive, treating the rise of new markets as a threat to existing dominance. That approach often leads to protectionism, friction, and diminishing returns. The other path is collaborative, recognizing Africa's growth as an opportunity to build partnerships, share technology, and expand global reach. History suggests the second path delivers more sustainable outcomes. The auto industry has reinvented itself many times before, from the rise of Japanese manufacturing in the late 20th century to the expansion of production into Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. Adaptation has always been part of survival. Africa represents the next chapter in that ongoing story. What distinguishes this moment is timing. Africa's rise is coinciding with a broader restructuring of global trade. Supply chains are shortening, regional blocs are gaining importance, companies are prioritizing stability alongside profitability. In that environment, markets that offer scale, growth, and policy alignment become invaluable. Africa increasingly fits that profile. This does not mean challenges disappear. Infrastructure gaps remain. Regulatory environments vary widely between countries. Political risk must be managed carefully, but these challenges are being weighed against long-term potential, and for many companies, the balance is tipping. The conversation is no longer about whether Africa can support industrial growth. It is about how quickly that growth can be integrated into global systems. For workers and communities in traditional manufacturing hubs, this shift can feel unsettling. Globalization has always carried uneven effects. But the lesson of this moment is not that opportunity is leaving it, is that opportunity is moving, expanding, and diversifying. The future of the auto industry will not be anchored to one nation or one continent. It will be distributed across regions that are willing to invest, adapt, and collaborate. Africa is signaling that it is ready to play that role, and the world is responding. As automakers continue to navigate uncertainty from trade policy to technological disruption, Africa's steady rise offers a counterpoint to instability. It represents growth rooted in fundamentals, people, demand, and long-term development. This is why the shift matters, not because one market is failing, but because the global system is evolving. The U.S. auto industry remains a major force. Its innovation, expertise, and scale are unmatched in many areas. But its future influence will be shaped by how it engages with a changing world, one where Africa is no longer peripheral. In the years ahead, decisions made today will define who leads tomorrow. Companies that recognize Africa's role early will be positioned to grow alongside it. Those that hesitate may find themselves adjusting later under greater pressure. This is not a zero-sum story. It is a story of expansion, of a global industry learning to operate in a multipolar world, and of Africa stepping forward not with disruption but with opportunity. As this transformation continues, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The future of the auto industry will be written across many continents, and Africa will be one of them.